this year for our lecture series, the Eisner lecture series that we do once every year. We have the amazing Nora Krug with us. Yay! This is where applause would normally go. Hey, Nora.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. I just want to give a quick shout out to some of our event sponsors. This event every year, it's a really fun to do that we normally do up here in the Upper Valley. But this year it's going to be a little different. But nonetheless, it has been put on by the Center for Cartoon Studies, the Leslie Center of Humanities at Dartmouth College, and the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation. So thank you to all three of those groups for making this possible. I also want to send a special thank you to Nancy and Carl Gropper. If it wasn't for those two human beings, this event would never happen. And because of them, we're able to do it every year. So Nancy and Carl, if you're out there, thank you so much. Nora Krug is a German-American author and illustrator whose drawings and visual narratives have appeared in publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde Diplomatique, in a Public Space, and in anthologies published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Simon & Schuster, and Chronicle Books. Her visual memoir, Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home, about World War II and her own German family history, was chosen by myriad publications as a best book of 2018, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Time Magazine. Her visual biography, Kamikaze, about a surviving Japanese World War II pilot, was included in Houghton Mifflin's Best American Comics and Best Non-Required Reading. Krug is Associate Professor of Illustration at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. CCS is honored to welcome Nora Krug. Hi, Nora. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to have you here with us. Are you in New York?
Yes, I'm in Brooklyn.
How are you holding up there? You're kind of at ground zero.
Yeah, I mean, I've been staying inside for the past 5 weeks approximately, so I can only see through my window what's happening, and I see everybody's basically wearing a mask now on the streets, and yeah, I don't have a TV, so I read more about what's going on rather than see the actual terrifying images, but it's no fun for anybody in the world, obviously, at the moment.
Well, we're so glad you're here with us today and that you're safe with your family.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Nora, if I remember correctly, we were going to start with a reading. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we jump into that?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, first of all, that I can't be there in person. I would love to see you all and visited your wonderful school. I think I visited it once 15 years ago, which is kind of shocking, but I had been looking forward to coming back and potentially seeing your work. But I'm glad we can meet digitally at least. Yeah, I am going to talk today about my book Belonging. And before I do a short reading from the book, I wanted to talk a little bit about it. It's almost 300-page visual memoir about World War II and my German family history. I grew up in Germany in the 70s and 80s and basically didn't really know anything about my family's involvement under the Nazi regime, which is something that had been a big, basically like a blind spot in my life, and I think most Germans' lives of my generation. Not because our parents didn't talk much about it, but the grandparents' generation, for the most part, didn't. So I always knew that nobody in my family had been a major Nazi figure, because that kind of thing you would have known about growing up in my generation. But I still didn't know anything about their political position or anything like that in the war. And I felt a growing urge to find out more about that, especially when I moved to the United States. And I felt in a strange way more confronted with my German heritage than ever before, because living as a German amongst non-Germans, you see yourself more as a representative of your own culture and your country's history. And so I started doing research, and that's what became my book. So I'm going to read to you chapter 3 from my book. I'm going to switch to screen sharing. Okay. So this is the cover of my book. The one on the left is the hardcover edition, and the one on the right, the softcover edition that came out more recently. I mean, there's a lot to say about why the design changed, but maybe we can go into this at a later point. I'm going to read chapter 3, which is called Poisonous Mushrooms. Every year we went to Italy for a family vacation. To us, Italy represented everything Germany didn't have, or perhaps elements it once had, but lost in the perfectionist reconstruction of the post-war years. Here we could feel uninhibited and live the exotic fantasy of Southern European life. We spent days driving around in our non-air-conditioned green Volvo, exploring small medieval towns, sampling local delicacies, visiting remote museums, and following in the footsteps of famous artists, writers, and filmmakers. On one of those excursions, we visited a large military cemetery. The cemetery's geometric precision was intimidating. Near the entrance, we found an inscription in German. Selig sind, die da Leid tragen, denn sie sollen getröstet werden. Blessed are they who are suffering, for they shall be comforted. Buried beneath our feet lay the bodies of German, not Italian, World War II soldiers. A few decades after the end of the war, 30,683 of them had been dug up for identification from nearby provisional graves and finally reburied here. The cemetery was vast. We made our way through the labyrinth in silence. Suddenly, my father disappeared. After a while, we spotted him in the distance. He walked briskly and held a piece of paper in his hands. "What are you looking for?" "My brother." I'd always known that I had an uncle who died young. "He fell in the war," my father used to say, but nobody in my family seemed to know how or where he was killed. I knew that my uncle had been the heir to my grandparents' land in Kölsheim, a tiny town in southwest Germany, surrounded by fields, forests, and vineyards. I knew that my father was born a few years after my uncle's death, and that his parents had named him after his dead brother, Franz Karl. I knew that, because my uncle had died, they expected my father to inherit and tend to their farm, to look after the animals, the fields, and the plum trees. And I knew that my father had never fulfilled that expectation. As a teenager, I discovered a musty-smelling box in the drawer of the mahogany cabinet in our living room. It contained old photographs of my uncle and a few of his sixth grade school exercise books. They described the life cycle of the Maybach and the history of European forestry, the heroic Viking adventures and the havoc of the 30 Years' War, the importance, do you still see my screen?
Yes, we still see it.
Sorry, I changed something. Okay. The importance of charity and the necessity of personal hygiene, the Führer's difficult childhood and his reintroduction of Mother's Day to celebrate German women and their Aryan children. Number 2, how I honored my darling mother. When I woke up on Mother's Day, I quickly got out of bed and put on my clothes, then quickly into the garden to pick a bunch of flowers, which I put next to Mother's bed. When she woke up, I gave her my best Mother's Day wishes. Then I went out into the kitchen and put a cup on the table for her. On the cup it said, Mother's Day. I also put a piece of cake on the table. At noon, I went into the forest and picked a bunch of mayflowers for her. Kölsheim, May 31st, 1938. Franz Karl, 1936. All throughout my father's childhood, his mother told him that his brother had been a sweet and well-behaved boy. Franz Karl, 1956. Unlike my father, who was a stubborn and ill-tempered child. My father spent days skipping first kindergarten, then school, playing all by himself on the grounds of Kölsheim's medieval castle. My uncle was a complete stranger to me. I didn't know anyone who had known him. War and death were the only things I associated with him. Because he had been one of Hitler's soldiers, I learned early on that I wasn't supposed to feel sadness over his early death. His photos and exercise books were the only physical evidence of his existence, and I tried desperately to find him somewhere in between the lines of his propagandistic essays. It was like searching a concrete wall for cracks and leaks. Examining the stories written in my uncle's neat handwriting and the illustrations with which he carefully decorated the margins was an intimate but chilling experience. The books intrigued me, but I never showed them to any of my friends. Number 11, The Jew, a Poisonous Mushroom. When you go to the forest and you see mushrooms that look beautiful, you think that they are good. But when you eat them, they are poisonous and can kill a whole family. The Jew is just like this mushroom. When you see the Jew from behind, you don't immediately recognize him. But if you talk to him, you recognize him immediately. He pretends to be nice and flatters you shamelessly. Just like the poisonous mushroom can kill a whole family, the Jew can kill a whole people. Kulsheim, January 20th, 1939. From the Notebook of a Homesick Emigre, Things German, number 3, Das Pilze sammeln. Collecting mushrooms with my family, examining each mushroom carefully and comparing it to the corresponding picture in the Pilzführer mushroom guidebook before placing it in the woven basket. Back home, scrubbing off the bits of earth on the stem and in between the gills, and then sauteing the mushrooms in a pan with butter, salt, and pepper, and eating them with a piece of dark rye bread. By eating the mushrooms, I feel as I've become part of the forest. The poisonous red and white polka-dotted mushroom is depicted in many German children's books. On New Year's Day, it is a symbol of good luck that appears on greeting cards and in marzipan sweets made in its shape. My mother, dressed as a poisonous mushroom, 1953, costume made by my grandmother. To this day, she remembers the moment the picture was taken because of how disappointed she was that she couldn't be a princess instead. My uncle signed his name beneath the mushroom story and added the date, January 20th, 1939. On that same day, the mayor of Dachau reports that his town is now cleared of all Jews. A hearing in Berlin takes place about the sterilization of a mentally unstable woman. Stalin endorses the use of torture, and Joseph Goebbels writes in his diary, "Talk things through with the Führer for 2 hours. He's so good and humane to me. One has to love him." 10 days later, Adolf Hitler will give a speech proclaiming that if Jewish financiers should plunge the nations into a world war yet again, the outcome will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Was my uncle's story influenced by The Poisonous Mushroom, the 1938 collection of anti-Semitic children's stories? The book was given out for free by the National Socialists. In one of the stories, a mother and her blonde, lederhosen-clad son go for a walk in the forest, where she compares Jews to poisonous mushrooms. Coincidentally, the name of the boy in the story was Franz, the same name as my uncle's. It takes great effort to learn to write. How much effort did it take my uncle to write a story like the one about the mushroom? Content B, spelling C+, calligraphy C. The teacher marked 3 spelling mistakes and 2 grammatical mistakes in the mushroom story and signed it ST. Although he expected my uncle to do better, he was satisfied with the story's content. Adolf Hitler, 1938. Our youth shall learn nothing but to think German and to act German. A young boy or a young girl enters into our organizations at age 10, then they move on from the junior Hitler Youth to the Hitler Youth 4 years later, and we'll keep them there for another 4 years, and then put them into the Party or the Labor Front, the Assault Division or the SS. And if there's still a bit of class consciousness and elitist thinking left in them, they'll receive further treatment from the armed forces. And when they return after 2 or 3 or 4 years, we'll put them back into the Assault Division or SS so that they won't relapse, and they shall never be free again for the rest of their lives. My uncle, 1939, with a goat given to him for First Communion. My uncle was born in 1926. In 1936, the National Socialists announced that 90% of all children born in 1926 had successfully been recruited into the Hitler Youth. By 1939, joining had become mandatory. Kürsheim is a small town. Jews and Christians lived side by side, engaged in trade for centuries. My uncle probably knew the Jewish boys and girls who lived in town. He was 12 years old when he wrote the story in his exercise book. Too young to understand the power of Nazi propaganda, but old enough to understand that Jews are not like poisonous mushrooms. From the scrapbook of a memory archivist, flea market find number 1, Child's Play. A. Caricature of a Jew, 20 cents. B. Toy made in the honor of the Führer's birthday, €4. C. Hitler Youth trading cards, set of 10, €2. D. Brooches given in exchange for winter relief donations, €4 each. E. Primer, €1. It turned out that my father had gone to the cemetery chapel, and for reasons unknown even to himself, had scanned the names in the register. There, among the thousands of names his eyes had rested on for a fraction of a second, names that had once been called from kitchen windows at dinner time, names written on Christmas gifts and school exercise books, names spoken severely in classrooms, names pronounced ceremoniously by mayors on enlistment day, names whispered by girls and women the night before departure, names shouted out on the battlefield when a response could no longer be expected, names reported to superiors, names spelled out on clacking typewriters in colonel secretaries' offices, names read, reread, and read again on damp military stationery, names chiseled into stones, names remembered quietly by mothers and fathers before a final breath was taken. Among all these unfamiliar names belonging to people unknown to him, my father found what he had been looking for, his own name. The number on the piece of paper my father was holding specified the exact location of my uncle's grave. The gravestone was meticulously maintained. Inscribed on it was the name that my uncle and my father had always shared. For the first time, I experienced the loss of my uncle's life in a physical way. Briefly, he emerged from the depths of the heavy mahogany cabinet, not as a shadow, but as a human being, whose eyes I could have looked into and said, "Uncle," who could have given me a goat as a gift for First Communion, whose children's outgrown clothes I could have worn, and to whom I could have sent a postcard from Italy that summer, telling him about our visit to a German World War II cemetery that was filled with gravestones inscribed with the names of total strangers. Standing at his grave, I longed to understand what it felt like to be him. Was he proud to fight in the war? Was he afraid? What was the last thing he saw, the last thought he had? "This is the closest I've ever been to my brother," my father said. 2 photographs placed on top of each other matched perfectly. 2 arms, each holding a First Communion candle. 2 arms, each holding a hymn book. The new face that emerges looks directly at me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was beautiful. Something that really strikes me as I'm watching you and listening to you read that is how much it really feels like you've put me as the reader in a place where I've come across some sort of family album or scrapbook in an attic somewhere, and I'm pouring through it and sort of discovering this familial history. And I'd love to dig into some of the choices you made as far as the physical structure of the book in that way in a little bit. But I just wanted to say that at the top because it really puts you in that place. And I think that kind of leads me into the first portion that I want to talk about with you today. You have an interesting historical background that you're exploring by way of your German heritage that I think isn't completely unlike what we have here in the States in terms of our like shameful history with slavery, although our countries have chosen to deal with it historically in very different ways. And of course, there are a lot of differences. But Germany in general has chosen to go the route of guilt and sort of almost a kind of atonement of those sins, for lack of a better word. America, for the longest time, has kind of chosen the route of trying to kind of brush it off or pretend like it doesn't exist. And we're only just now, I feel like, starting to ask ourselves some of those deeper questions. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to try to address a history that is so fraught with guilt, and what ultimately your goal was with this book in terms of trying to address and learn about those things.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think Germany has done a lot of work in trying to understand why what happened, and in trying to not come to terms with it, because it's not something you can ever come to terms with, but to try to, to openly look at what happened and improve our society. And that's obviously a very important thing that begins with school education. It also is the work of institutions, I think, to publicly demonstrate and admit to one's guilt, one's country's guilt. And so I grew up in my generation learning an incredible amount about the Holocaust. We analyzed Adolf Hitler's speeches word by word, for instance, to see how he used and abused language to seize power and to maintain power and to indoctrinate. And we also visited concentration camp museums, and all of that was very, very important in our emotional understanding of what happened and our historic understanding. But what I came to realize only in retrospect is that we weren't really provided with the tools to address the subject on a personal level. I mean, of course, it always depended on who your teacher was, what generation your teacher was of, which state in Germany you grew up in, who your parents were. But I think for the most part, what we learned really on a collective level and not so much on an individual level. And that is something I only came to realize as I moved abroad, first to England and then to America, because here I was an individual German abroad. And it's much easier, and I think that's probably the same for Americans. In America, I could imagine, is that it's easier to hide it behind your collective past when you live in this collective body of people. But when you leave that collective mindset, you are suddenly confronted with it in a very different way. And, I would be asked by complete strangers, more or less, what my own family history was. And I couldn't answer that question because I didn't know. And I had somehow thought I had learned everything there was to learn about the Holocaust because of the amount of stuff we learned in school. But then I realized it was all on a collective level. And that's a very important level. I'm not saying that shouldn't have happened to that degree. I think the collective is as important as the individual. But that was the impulse for why I wanted to write the book. Another thing is, I live in the city that was the first entry point for many European refugees from the second, who fled from the Nazi regime. So and who remained there. So I was surrounded by this culture that was deeply traumatized, and yet I knew nothing about Jewish contemporary culture. For instance, that was another oversight by the German educational system, I think, is that the only things we associated with Jews were the Holocaust. And so I suddenly had all these Jewish friends and colleagues, and my husband is Jewish, and that was a very different way of being confronted with the Jewish culture than I'd ever experienced as a German before. So that propelled me into going back to Germany and doing the research I had never done before.
Yeah, you've said before that that you found certain ways that Germany in the education system addressed the learning about this history having it's some level of being problematic because it resulted in a generalized guilt, like as a culture, but not necessarily a constructive guilt. Do you feel like doing this story, Belonging, being able to kind of dig into your personal history, is that where you see guilt being able to be more constructive? Was it constructive for you?
Yes, I mean, what I want to say is that the book was never an attempt of making myself feel better. So that was never the goal of the book, to overcome the guilt entirely, or to shed myself from it, or to move on, in quotation marks, and leave the past behind, which I think is always a bad idea, because we are made of the past and we can't separate from our past. I mean, that's true for any culture. We are made of the past because everything we know and do is built on what happened before, obviously. So that was never the goal, but the goal was to try to understand it better, to try to understand what war does to generations, also to Germans, and how this memory of war is transferred in positive and in negative ways from generation to generation, how it shifts, and how we sometimes try to believe things that aren't really true in our families, how we have these family narratives that we don't question, that we just take for granted, and what that does to our families over generations. And yeah, I think what writing and illustrating the book really helped me do is it helped me handle the guilt in a more constructive way, as you said, because now I know that I have faced it, that there was nothing I tried to hide. There was also nothing I took out of the story because it was too risky or uncomfortable. I asked all the questions that I was able to ask. I found as much information as I believe I could have found. I mean, maybe there's more out there, but the question is always, how do you get to it? How do you find it? And that just makes me feel, better. I mean, personally, I think there's only things you can gain when you dig into these uncomfortable truths.
It's interesting to hear about this from my perspective as an American, because even in my generation, as a millennial, I didn't grow up learning about the atrocities of our own history as a country. And in fact, it was kind of more of a fairy tale version in a lot of elementary school history. And even now, I think there's a faction of our culture when someone puts out some kind of artwork or story that tries to challenge people to kind of look a little bit more at the atrocities. There'll be pushback of like, why should I have to feel guilty about this? I wasn't there. This was my ancestors. And I don't know if that's just uniquely an American cultural thing, but it's just interesting to see the differences there. And I'm curious how, after having put out this book, people in Germany specifically reacted to it, and then how people maybe of different cultures reacted to it outside of Germany.
Yeah, I mean, the book was probably most successful in Germany, which made me feel very, it made me feel good, because it told me that many, many Germans feel the way I do. It was a bestseller there, and also 3 different states reprinted educational editions so that it would be more affordable to teachers, which I think is great, because again, it shows me that people there want to maintain for future generations this idea that we have to face our past. We have to continue to talk about these things. The question is always how we do that. And of course, some people, and I think that's not unique to America, and also not to Germany, there will always be people who feel threatened by that idea, because they somehow think that when you look at the negative side of our culture, it somehow makes the whole country look bad. And that's something I don't understand, because every country in the world has has committed crimes and has these dark moments in their histories, that doesn't mean that we can't embrace them as countries or that we can't love them. In Germany, we almost have the opposite problem, is that most Germans probably wouldn't comfortably say the phrase, I love Germany. It's still something that doesn't come easily to Germans, including myself. And that's an equal, to an equal degree a problem, because then you leave it up to the extreme right in Germany to profess to this love, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. So I think a well-measured, degree of both is really the way to move forward. I think you have to be able to look back at these uncomfortable moments in history, and at the same time be able to express your appreciation for your culture and country. But yeah, the book was very well received in Germany. And then in the United States, I mean, one thing that I also felt good about was that wherever I give talks, the conversation then, veers away from my book and my family and my country, and it becomes about anybody's responsibility in any country, because it's really not. I mean, I had hoped from the beginning that it wouldn't be just a book about, my family or my country, but that there's a universal quality to it that I think anybody hopefully could relate to. And that's been the case so far in the countries where I've presented the book.
The book was originally titled in Germany, Heimat, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which I understand to be somewhat a not entirely possible word to translate, that it's a uniquely German word. Here in the States and in English, it's translated as belonging. I'm curious if you could speak a bit to that word Heimat and what it means to you in terms of both as a title and as like a descriptor of what you're trying to accomplish with the book.
Yeah. So the word basically means the feeling, that you have towards the place that you feel like you most belong to or belonged to. So the place that has formed you culturally, and in anything relating to food, ranging from food to landscape to music. So the place that has deeply formed who you are as a thinking and feeling human being. And in Germany, again, it's a very conflicted term, because when the Nazis came along, they misused it and they misappropriated it to describe a space that was only accessible to a certain kind of German person, for instance, not a Jewish German person. And which is why, ever since the end of the Second World War, it has not really been used by many Germans. It has had this negative connotation for many Germans. And that's still the case today, even though in recent years it's become, again, a little bit, both the extreme right has been trying to claim it again for themselves, but it's also become kind of a trendy term. And I think that has to do with globalization, that people, again, all over the world, but including in Germany, have begun to ask themselves again, what does my culture really mean? Going back to some sort of feeling of where your cultural roots are. And in Germany, initially, we didn't want to call the book Heimat. Actually, in America, we wanted to call it that. My American publisher and I wanted to call it Heimat initially. And Germany did not want to call it that because it's such a tricky term. But then during the course of my writing and illustrating the book, which took 6 years, the German political landscape changed, and a new far-right party emerged and became more powerful than people would have, I think, ever thought could be the case again in Germany. And that's when my German publisher and I completely changed our minds, and we decided to call it Heimat in order to take the term away from that group, to basically say, wait, you can't monopolize this term just because you don't like immigration or whatever. You as a German who thinks back critically at what we've done, we can also claim this term for us. And so that's why we called it Heimat in Germany. And then all the other foreign editions so far have called it that as well, except for Korea, which I'm told there is a supermarket chain that has a similar name. So that's
Heimat. Yeah.
they don't want to call it that there. But and then in America, it flipped as well. Right before publication, there was actually concern that the term could evoke negative feelings amongst an American audience that has its own, Holocaust trauma. So then in America, we were looking for a good translation, and, homeland would have just had very different connotations. So we just focused more on the feeling of the term rather than a direct translation. And I do think that the term also exists in other countries. I think Korean has a term for that. I think there are other languages who do. So I don't think it's untranslatable, but obviously it means something very specific to whichever country the term derives from.
Right, and some of the loaded qualities to it aren't. That's something I don't have when I, pick up and read that word. Whereas I'm assuming someone in Germany, as soon as they see it, they're flooded with all of these experiences. In the subtitle of the book, you, at least in the English translation, you use the word reckoning. Which I think is a very interesting choice of a word, because it sort of implies something that is unavoidably going to kind of come back and bite you or visit you, whether you choose to or not.
Yeah, I mean, these things, these narratives, these family narratives that are hidden, they make up who we are. And if we don't talk about them, they're still present in our behavior, in our way in which we avoid certain topics in general, in the way that maybe that makes us shying away from other difficult subjects. I mean, I think all these things leave a mark on us, and they leave marks over generations. And I think we often underestimate how deeply impacted we are by our country's histories. I mean, when you think about Germany, the 30 years war, which was centuries ago, is actually said to be one of the factors that has created this German angst that, people speak about today still, that, because we were at the center of so many European wars, that has actually shaped our need for security, which I think is a big part of, personally, a big part of German culture identity or cultural behavior. So I think we need to actually appreciate and recognize that we are deeply, deeply impacted by our pasts. And I think that's something that would be helpful on a political level too, if that happened. Because I think there's a certain short-sightedness that happens in both towards the past and the future. What's interesting too is that there's a word in German that probably has the same root. I mean, I've never thought about that before, but rächen, which means to take revenge, actually. So in a way that relates to what you're saying, it's almost as if our history takes revenge by re-emerging at various times and not leaving us alone.
It's interesting because a colleague of ours, Jason Lutz, just finished Berlin last year, his lifelong epic that he's been working on about the rise of Nazism in Germany. And it just feels like your book, his book, have, I guess, to use how Jason would describe it, as a kind of unfortunate relevancy today in both of our countries, both in America and Germany and all over the world, a kind of unfortunate seeming rise in fascism, in radical thought. Do you feel like the timing of that for your personal project was intentional, or something that just kind of happened to coincide?
I think it happened to coincide because I remember it, it changing in Germany as I was working on the book. I had only thought about its relevance to me and to my personal life when I embarked on the project. I mean, of course, there have always been, neo-Nazis in Germany, but it hadn't been on a parliamentary level since the end of the Second World War, that actually they got so many votes. I mean, just to be honest, to Germany compared to other European countries, it's actually still a minority, but much stronger than we ever thought it could be. And we have to face that, and we have to try to oppose that in any way we can. It's very unfortunate that it has become this relevant.
Yeah, it does feel like part of that kind of reckoning that we're talking about, that history will continue to bring these challenges before us until we address them.
And that also at a time where people even debate what's a fact and what isn't. I mean, if we've come this far, we're at a very dangerous level. I mean, if there are still people out there who deny the Holocaust, or who, I mean, if somebody wants to believe something, they just believe it. And, I mean, there's basically nothing you can do. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. I mean, to talk about alternative truths and all that stuff, it's, there are facts and we have to learn them in school. I mean, that's always the basic thing, is that education, people are educated from a young age about historic facts, and also given the tools to make sure they don't happen again. And that has to start in, early childhood, because otherwise it's, we're going to be in a very dangerous spot.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the personal side of the project. At CCS, we have a lot of students who work in memoir. And I think something that's interesting and challenging about memoir is the fact that you're telling essentially a nonfiction story about usually your life and the people around you. I'm curious how you navigated those waters. I ask most memoirs this when I interview them, because everyone has a different answer and a different approach about how they qualify it to their family members and the people that are represented in the story. Do they get permission? Do they change names? How has the family reacted to having read the book? Do they read the book? What has been the reaction and or fallout?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, I think when you write a memoir, you have to try to go into the process in as truthful a way as possible, even if you know that you might disgruntle or hurt somebody's feeling in the long run. Because I think if you start out worrying about that, you're not going to be true to yourself or to the story. And you can still at a later point think about which moments in the story you soften, or if you want to change names. But I think the whole point of a memoir is to be honest. And if you don't do that, then there's no point in writing it. So, of course, it differs with different family members. I mean, in my case, the two protagonists are my maternal grandfather and my paternal uncle, both of whom are dead. And of course, that made a big difference. I don't know if I would have written the book if my grandfather had still been alive, but that would have also depended on the kind of relationship I would have had with him. And I don't know what that would be, because he died when I was 8. So there's no way in which I can say what my relationship today would be like with him if he was still alive. But that said, there are many other people I wrote about in the book who are alive, and I didn't know what their reactions would be. I'm very lucky that I have a very close relationship to both my father and my mother, which means that I told them from the beginning about the fact that I was going to write a book about this. They trusted me. They trusted me in that they knew that the book wasn't about pointing your finger at somebody, easily blaming somebody or easily speaking somebody, free of guilt. I mean, that was also the point of my personal approach, was not to find an easy answer or not to immediately judge in either way, but to examine and to try to listen to my own feelings as I was going through this examination process and what that would do to me, and write about what that's doing to me. And so my parents knew that, and they knew I wasn't just going to make somebody look bad. And so they basically they supported my research. It sometimes even helped me with the research. And then I chose to show them the final manuscript before I sent it to my publisher. But that was my own free decision, because my relationship to them is too important for me to want it to suffer from that. But they did not ask me to change anything. And had I suspected that they would, I might have not shown them the manuscript, because I had thought very deeply about whether something would be hurtful or not, and so I was happy with the text the way it was when it was done, and I think it would have been hard for me if they had demanded that I change something. And then there were those people who, in the case of my paternal aunt, my father's sister, which I had never met. I don't think she even knew that I existed, because they had a fallout, from the time before I was born. And so I was worried about what she might think, that I write so openly about their relationship, their fraught relationship. And that is why I changed her name in the book. I decided to do that. And I also changed the names of other people in that village, because it is a small town. So people, probably immediately know who's who. And I just wanted to, be sensitive towards that. But other than that, and then when the book came out, I basically only got positive responses from my family. Again, I feel like I was very lucky in that. My aunt, the one I just talked about, she passed away, sadly, a few weeks, I believe, after the book came out. So I don't know whether she saw it or whether she read it. But my male cousin, who I also write about in the book, thanked me for doing the research that he had not done before. So I was very happy that that nobody felt actually like I was going too far. Or but again, I think it's very important when you start out that you don't worry too much about these things, that you trust your instinct and you trust your sensibility, and you can work out the details later, but you need to go in there with an open mind, I think.
It seems like every memoirist, graphic memoirist, needs to decide where they're going to land on the fiction versus nonfiction, story versus history quality of the work, because inevitably, to some degree, this is a kind of story shaping of life, which in general doesn't unfold like a story would, with these kind of act structures and all that sort of stuff. So an artist at some point needs to make a decision about how much am I going to kind of shape this into a satisfying narrative, and how much am I going to let bear just the kind of like flat history of it. Your book in general, to me, feels like it's picked a little bit more toward the side of just kind of laying out the history rather than imbuing it with narrative meaning after the fact. Would you agree with that? And was it a conscious choice how you chose to lay out the history?
I clearly see this as a nonfiction book for myself. So everything I write about is true. I didn't make anything up. I did change the chronology a little bit because, they need, as you say, there needed to be a dramatic curve. So I chose to end the book with my encounter with my aunt, who I'd never met before. I might have gone back to the archive after I met her, but in the book, I gave it a different chronology. But everything I write about happened the way it did. When I write about my childhood, of course, I'm relying on my memory, and we all know that that's sometimes unreliable. But I try to the best of my, knowledge to write about encounters and dialogues the way I remember them. I also took notes as I interviewed people. So, I chose not to use recording devices because my experience was that put people off a little bit, and they were a bit more hesitant about what they were telling me. So I usually went into conversations with my notebooks, and then also took notes after the meetings. And yeah, and then of course there's a whole visual component. So I was just talking about the writing just now, but when you create images, of course you leave some of it open to your imagination. So those moments where I write about my grandfather's or my grandparents' lives under the regime, and I show them in a private setting, of course I have no visual evidence for those moments. So they're obviously made up. Again, I had to rely on the stories that my aunt and my mother told me about my grandfather. And then I had to visually fill in the gaps. I didn't do that with the words, but I did it with the images, because you have to, when you talk about, when you illustrate somebody's life, you have to imagine how they moved, how they dressed, what they looked like when they were surprised or sad or happy, how they talked, what their apartment looked like, because there's no way you can get visual evidence for all of these things. And when you want to make history come alive, and that's the great thing about historical visual nonfiction, I think, is that, same with Jason Lutz and books, is it just brings you those facts. You can enter that space on a much more emotional level than would be the case in a school history book, where you really just get the facts. And you often forget in retrospect that these facts were not facts when they were lived. They were lived moments that left emotional marks on people on an everyday level. And that's what illustrators do. They show you that everyday level and that personal space. And that's why it's such a powerful tool, illustration. But of course, there's a certain amount of imagination involved.
I want to take a break in a second, but before we go to that, I just want to ask how you, if you could break down the sort of chronology of what it looked like to work on this book. How long were you researching versus how long were you drafting and then drawing?
It was really a very neat breakup into three times two. So I researched for 2 years, and that research was both family research, going into archives, talking to people who knew my family members when they were still alive, going to the towns where they came from. So, field research, archival research, but then again, also the grander research. I did go back into the research on the Second World War and refreshed my memory about certain things. And then part of those 2 years were also trying to overcome my feelings of hesitation, because I really set out feeling like, well, do I have the right as a German, as somebody representing the perpetrators, do I have the right to tell a story that so much talks about the German side of the trauma? I mean, even using the word trauma from the German perspective could be seen as, critical, but it was a trauma for Germans too, but a trauma that they brought on themselves. I mean, it was a self-induced trauma. So it took me 2 years to get the courage, not to tell my personal family story, but to tell a story from a German perspective at all. And then the next 2 years were spent writing, and I really decided to only focus on the writing. I didn't want to start with the drawing, because I was worried that I would change so much of the writing that I'd have to start from scratch with the illustrations. So I decided to really get the story down in Word. And I sometimes put a few notes in the Word document about how I wanted to illustrate a certain scene, but that often changed in retrospect. And then when the text was done, and I had already been working with my editor, who really line edited the text at my publishing house, and she was wonderful. She really improved the narrative in a way. Then I sat down and began with the illustrations, and that took another 2 years. So 6 years in total.
I want to talk a bit about some of the process portions of your work. And let's start with kind of bridging the gap from the cultural personal side to the mark making itself. How much decision was there in terms of making the artwork at all culturally German specific? Were you reaching back to any historical illustrative styles or anything like that? Or is that just the way you draw?
Yeah, I don't think there was a conscious decision to do that because of the subject matter of the book. I think it's just what I've been influenced by. So I'm a big fan of German expressionism, for instance, people like Otto Dix and George Grosz, who've also done work on war. And so I think there's probably some of that, but I also like, medieval and Renaissance art. So I think there's some of that in there as well. Yeah, as you can probably see, the book was has this kind of collage feel quality to it. So I'm using a multitude of different styles, for lack of a better word, and materials. And the reason for that is that I didn't want to make it a graphic novel in the traditional sense, in quotation marks, because I wanted to move away from the immediacy of, because it's such a personal project, I didn't want to show myself in the image, for instance, sitting at the archive, while I also write about myself sitting at the archive. And I knew that there was a lot of writing involved, probably more than in an average graphic novel, which is why I also had less space on the page for images. And so I just wanted to keep it a bit looser, and I didn't want to replicate what was said in the text in the image. Had I worked more in a graphic novel panel-based style, I think I would have probably had to reduce the writing. And that's just not what I wanted to do with this particular book. I also thought a lot about the nature of memory and how fragmentary memory is, and how we, turn it into a narrative in retrospect in order to make sense of our memories and eventually of who we are. And so I wanted to also visually represent this sense of fragmentation that has a specific order in a way.
Could you break down a little bit about the tools you used, how you kind of go about developing the page in terms of, do you pencil, do you work digitally or traditionally, that kind of stuff?
I always use the cheapest materials. I'm not somebody who's married to particular pens or paper. I love the pencil just because it's so organic in a way, and it's also not as harsh and solid. I like that the line is kind of broken up a little bit. So everything, or most of the things that I drew that have an outline in the book, I first drew with pencil, and then scanned it in, and then arranged this is also hand lettered, which I wouldn't recommend to any of you to do, and I will never do it again in my life, because every single change.
Don't say that. Don't say that. It's so good for it.
Yes, but I don't have the German edition here. I can get it, but for all the foreign editions, except the non-Roman letter editions, I've worked with designers in the specific countries who are using a font that I had made based on my hand lettering. So I agree that it has to have my personal note, so to speak. But I don't want to have to do it myself, especially with foreign editions. I wouldn't be able to take on any other project for the rest of my life. It's just so tedious. And so what I'm doing with the font is I go through every individual page with the foreign designers, because every page looks so different. So and then there are these pages where I kept the text very faint on purpose. And so I have to oversee all of the foreign editions to make sure the text is positioned in the right way, to make sure that the text has the right color. Here's this page where I basically faded out the text on purpose with each paragraph so that it would disappear in the snowy landscape. And it's really a matter of fine-tuning with every publisher. But anyway, so much for the text. Usually I work with a combination of hand-drawn image and computer. because when you use the computer, you can obviously work on the composition. You have more flexibility with the composition. I am also somebody who's not. I'm not like a good draftsman in the sense that I have a scene in my head and then I get it down exactly like I have it in my head. And I'm also quite a slow drawer. So to me, it's almost more like a sculptural process, putting an image together. It happens through a combination of drawing and erasing and drawing and erasing, and then scanning it in, shifting things around, sometimes changing the color on the computer, sometimes scanning in watercolor separately from the line and combining both in Photoshop. So I do appreciate this flexibility, because I'm just not natural in that way. And some of it was purely done by hand. Sometimes I used Photoshop to color, especially the comic pages. Something like that I did entirely by hand. And then this one I did the outline in black and white with pencil and colored it on the computer, but I gave it a little watercolor texture, so it looks a bit like it's watercolor. You probably see the difference, but
it's interesting to hear you talk about it as almost sculptural, because that's a bit of the feeling I get, is there's a kind of chiseling or patchwork quality to it, where it feels like the artwork is assembled in some way, which I think really lends itself to this particular story, where it's got a scrapbook sort of quality to it.
And it's like a search. The whole book is about an investigation, in a way, personal investigation. And I also thought a lot about it as not something necessary that comes together or builds up, but that also removes layers. I remove layers of not knowing, and to reveal the truth. And I use with this idea of, I work with the idea of erasure too, both in examples like I just showed with the disappearing text, but also there's this one moment in the book where I talk about my grandfather's brother who disappeared in Russia as a soldier, and I show the progression of his face disappearing, as I quote from the love letters he sent back home to his wife who lived in Switzerland. And so again, I thought a lot about this idea of removing rather than just adding things to the page, and also expressing this idea of silence through blankness, or the idea of intentional forgetting. So I am somebody who thinks a lot about the relationship between content and form. It's very important to me that the image conveys, the emotion and also the idea of what the moment is about, even in its material.
How much of that is intuition on your part, in terms of sitting with the page and kind of sculpting it around and moving things around, choosing when to have something be an actual physical item like a photo or some other kind of like scanned element versus a drawing itself, like when to make those choices, that I'm going to draw it, or versus I'm going to kind of cut and paste in this photo? Is that decided ahead of time, or more of a kind of sit down with it and use your intuition to kind of see what feels right?
Yeah, no, I think it's almost entirely intuition, although intuition also always has a certain element of control and rational thought, I think, embedded in it. So when I say intuition, I don't mean arbitrary. I think the key is always to find the middle ground between being intuitive and being able to rely, to trust your intuition, which is not always easy, and at the same time using your mind and being able to step back in the process, in the intuitive process, and step back from the page and say, is this really working? Or have I moved too far away from what I actually wanted to say? So I think you have to be in control of both. And I do think working for me is almost entirely intuitive. Because I'm also working on a new project at the moment, and I'm realizing I'm not really a big sketcher. I'm not really somebody who pencils out the whole thing and then inks it. because I don't know if it works until I've done the page almost to the degree where it's finished, which is a problem when you work with publishers, obviously, because you don't want to always start from scratch. But I think it's partly because my work is often very idea heavy, and so ideas, when you work with, I don't know. I think it's, that's also part of the reason for why I tend to work chronologically through the book. So for this book, I actually literally began with the end papers and then did every page in the order in which the reader was going to read it. And part of that is that I wanted, because I use such a multitude of different visual ways of working, I wanted to know what it would feel like for the reader to experience the book. I wanted to make sure that they wouldn't get distracted by the different styles and materials. I wanted to make sure the rhythm is right. So that's why I worked my way through it from the beginning to the end. But with each page, I basically worked on it until it was completely done before I moved on to the next one.
Nora, I just want to jump in real quick and just let you know that I'm still completely hearing you. Your video is getting a little spotty. I don't think there's much you can do about it, but and just as I said it, you've popped back, so I think we're fine. Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about the style of your of this particular book. There's something very disarming about the kind of sweetness and cartooniness of your artwork. It has a kind of childlike or innocent quality to it. It's not like hyper rendered. You're not like drawing people entirely realistically, although sometimes you do kind of play around with that spectrum. But then the content, the subject matter, is about as serious as we can get in this world. What do you see as the relationship between that? To some degree, I imagine it's just the way you draw. But it does interesting things in terms of how we as a reader receive that information.
Yeah, it's something that I read a lot in reviews, and especially people coming from outside the field do often, as you probably all know, equate drawing with something that only children do, or that's only done for children, which is always sad. So, but I do see how there's a kind of a naivete in the drawing, and I think it's a combination of, here I have these, they look very simple, but I have these more, realistic in quotation mark drawings of objects that I put in between because I wanted them to have this encyclopedic feel. So it's on the one hand, it's probably my inability to render things to that degree. But on the other hand, it's also a choice because it doesn't interest me so much to draw in that way. And it's also not something that was a very strong focus of my education when I went to school in Germany, to university. And that's something that I've only really thought about when I moved to the US as a student to study at the School of Visual Arts, where people were much more concerned with realism than I had ever experienced in Germany, where it was much more, the focus was much more on personal expression. I know that's also true in other countries, such as Japan. When you look at the history of Japanese wood blocks, it's always much more about the emotion that's, of course, any kind of illustration can convey emotion, but I think it's not really something that was important to my education as an illustrator as well, because of the people I studied with.
And to clarify, I think it's hard to find vocabulary to describe and talk about these differences in the ways we draw. So we end up saying something like childlike or innocent or something like that, and that kind of falls short for what I'm describing because
we look at someone like Charles Schulz,
it's just as sophisticated as whoever else, some artists who can draw someone looking photorealistic. And I think ultimately the way you've chosen to draw this book lends itself so well to the material you're talking about. When we see those pages like you read at the top of class about like excerpts from a child's notebook, it feels like the art kind of has to be that way to really drive home this kind of feeling of like looking into the past, specifically into the past of your family when all of us were younger. So anyway, I think for me, it feels like such a great marriage between those two seemingly conflicting ideas.
And I knew that you weren't, you weren't seeing it in a negative way. I just know that outside of the visual world, and that says something about our understanding of visuals, that their importance in society is that sadly often they're only associated with children's books.
Talk a little bit about how you developed your color palette. I love the use of color in this book. I think it's beautiful, but it also feels very cohesive, not random. Did you develop a specific palette to work within, or is it just you having like a natural sense of color?
Again, I'm fairly intuitive about these things, so I don't have a color palette. I didn't have a color palette in the sense that I had little swatches of color in front of me, but I did think of it again as a narrative tool. So what I decided was that I would use warm colors for one side of the family, because in my book the two family narratives are intertwined, and a cold color palette for the other side of the family. So the mother side of the family looks, somewhat like this. So I'm using mostly cold colors, and then I often highlight the protagonist in the opposite spectrum. So here's my grandfather, who is in a purple tone, so that the reader immediately, without me having to say, this is my grandfather, he pops out in a way, and he has the warmer tint. And then equally with my father's side of the story, maybe this is not the best example. Let me just see. It's kept in warmer colors, and then the protagonist is in a cooler color, so he pops out again. So I did this so that the reader would intuitively, it would help to differentiate between the two stories. This is always the chapter color of the paternal side of the family, and then this is the chapter color of the maternal side. So I used it mostly as a narrative tool, but I didn't really have a system in place that was particularly well thought through.
One of the things that really sticks out to me about the color is, although the color shifts depending on what you're talking about, and as you say, like different characters, whenever that shift happens, the colors have a symbiotic relationship, as in they feel analogous to each other. So I'm looking at those warmer colors, and it's not like you get a red and then like a yellow or something. You have things that in general feel like they kind of belong to a similar side of the color wheel. And I think that's just like such a smart and easy way to get something that feels well married in terms of color choices.
Yeah, and I think it also helped that I put a little bit of, I put like a yellow haze basically on everything in the book, like almost I coated the whole book with just a tiny bit of yellow.
And is that like a layer set to some kind of opacity?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say there are some pages in the English edition where the color came out differently from what I had expected. I try to create a kind of a unified look by I think adding this yellow haze over everything. I don't know if haze is the right word.
It's interesting because you break some of the rules some cartoonists have when it comes to page structure. A lot of cartoonists, including myself, sometimes I'll teach a lecture about the importance of a standard grid to kind of hang everything on. That like pages should always like stay within a certain element of a grid to make it feel well balanced or all part of one thing. There's a little bit more jumping around in this case, and I think it kind of harks back to this sculptural quality that we're talking about, or scrapbook quality, where sometimes you'll get a page that just has different elements sort of feeling like they're pasted in, and then you'll get like a standard comics page with like a grid quality to it. Is that just you sort of playing around, or is there some kind of, I guess, science behind it?
No, I mean, I have to say, just to give you a little background information, I went to a music middle and high school, and I almost ended up studying classical music. And I didn't know what I wanted to do for a long time. So I was not one of those people who, I mean, I love to draw, but who was always drawing and, you know, drawing comic. I mean, I did draw comics, but my interests were so wide that I was basically, by the time I graduated from high school, I was completely confused whether I should study psychology or music or art or acting, or, I mean, I had so many interests. And then I heard about a school that Paul McCartney had founded in Liverpool for actors, dancers, and designers. And I thought, well, this would be a great school for me to apply because there's so many different disciplines. And so I went there for 3 years, and I did all kinds of things: set design, CD cover design, playing in bands. And then I went to Berlin and wanted to study graphic design. Still didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was also interested in documentary film. And then I basically enrolled in an illustration class there because I was interested in the way that the teacher thought. And his thinking was really about drawing as a form of communicating your ideas about the world. And there was not much of a technical focus to the class. It was really just about how can I, you know, visualize my relationship to the world on a page. And I think everybody there worked very intuitively. And then I thought of ways in which I could bring in my documentary. I also studied documentary film there. And so, you know, my background was not specialized in that way. And I probably missed a lot of opportunities of learning those basics that you're talking about. I probably should enroll at your school. I think but that's what led me to break all these rules, because I think in the end I just figured out, okay, how does it work? You know, when does it work and when doesn't it work? And again, very intuitively, just looking at the page, staring at it sometimes for days, trying to figure out what the problem is, and then shifting stuff around until I felt like it looked okay.
Well, you can't teach comics, and anyone who says you can is just trying to grift you for money. So no, I'm just kidding. But
no, but it's good to know these basics. I mean, I should have learned them too.
Well, that kind of ties into something I wanted to ask you, because I noticed on your website, that you don't refer to yourself as a cartoonist. You refer to yourself as an author and illustrator. Do you see yourself as not a cartoonist for the reasons you just mentioned, or is that just kind of a branding choice?
So difficult, you know, these terms are so difficult because there's so many fusions of all of these things, and also whatever's in our head too. I mean, we don't, obviously all of your students don't only learn from cartoonists. I mean, I'm sure they have so many different influences from film, from literature, from, you know, and so part of it is just my diverse background, but I also worked as an illustrator for a long time, as an editorial illustrator. And then I did children's books, and then I did artist books, and I also did comics on the side. And this is my first long form comic book. I mean, you know, graphic novel or graphic memoir. I mean, then I called it a graphic novel and I called it a graphic memoir and not a graphic novel, because it's not a novel, because it's nonfiction. And it's just really tricky. So, I mean, everybody in the class would probably debate this, but I think everything we draw is an illustration in some way, because it, you know, illustrating obviously means to shed light on something, to, you know, to put a focus on something. And that's what we all do, no matter if we're cartoonists or filmmakers or illustrators or graphic novelists or children's book authors. And I think in a way, yeah, we make pictures, but, you know, picture makers, that's a stupid, I mean, it's such a, you know, banal sounding term. And so I think that's why I stuck with the term illustrator. And I can see myself doing all kinds of other things in the future. So I think if I called myself a cartoonist, I would just be pigeonholed into that one thing.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is such a like a strange stew of terms that none of us like completely knows how to navigate. You know, we've got the term comic, we've got the term graphic novel, we've got illustration. All those things bring different associations. So when I hear graphic novel, you know, increasingly that a lot of people view that as kind of like the NPR version of comics, right? So, comics are silly, but graphic novel, that's something I can still feel like intellectual about, or something like that. Whereas people sometimes struggle with the term comic or cartoonist. It's interesting to think about like navigating these terms. And I think that's something that we all as cartoonists or artists have to think about at some point, is like, even when I'm writing my bio, how am I going to present myself to the world? I'm sure to some degree, because of the nature of your story, you're also trying to catch maybe a different audience than obviously someone who's trying to read like a superhero story or something like that.
Yeah, again, I tend not to think so much of audiences, and again, maybe I should, but it's just, I always feel like it's best to rely on your, you know, what you feel is right. You know, I was trying to tell a story that makes sense, that has poetic qualities ideally to it, and that was, you know, that could engage the reader intellectually and emotionally. And I try to find the ways in which I, as who I am with my skills and my non-existing skills, you know, what would be the best way for me personally to do that. And that was what I was focusing on. And so I wasn't really thinking so much of an audience. Yeah.
Well, speaking of audience, I'm curious, you mentioned briefly something about this, I think, toward the beginning, but how much are young adult readers seeing this, and how much is this being folded into education, maybe in particular in Germany, and what is the age that you're typically seeing people digesting this work?
So when I do readings in Germany, unfortunately, the audience is always my generation and older. And I don't know why that is, because the expectation from the publisher was, and maybe it's fulfilled, I don't know what people, you know, read at home, but that because it's visual, it would attract a younger readership. But most people who come to my readings are of my generation and older, and I think it's partly because the subject is still so raw to them, as opposed to the next generation, where that they often don't know the generation that was the perpetrator generation in person. So they were born after that generation had passed away. Another thing is that, and sadly, more and more people don't read in general, whether it's, you know, visual books or non-visual books. But that said, as I mentioned before, 3 states in Germany have published educator-friendly editions of the book, and is now also for the second time has been nominated for the German Youth Literaturförderpreis, which is the most important prize for books for children and young adults. So it means that at least who's sitting in that jury feel strongly that people of that generation should have an interest in the subject matter. I mean, I do see it as a book that could, I forgot at what age people in Germany learn about the Holocaust, but I think it's probably around 12, but I could be wrong. So I do see it in, you know, this early teenage group could probably be the earliest group to read it, but I don't really know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I work at a cartoon school, so I'm biased towards cartooning, but it just feels like it's such an incredible tool to make dense history approachable, and digestible. And that's not like in a dumbing down kind of way, but just there's something about comics that feels powerfully equipped to lay out and kind of help people keep track of ideas. And that's what I find with your book, is like a great asset. Is the if you were to just have laid this all out in prose, I don't think I would retain the same information I do as I'm kind of like moving through a kind of visual interpretation of it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it always depends on the writing. I mean, when you read non-visual books, you can, of course, also get very engaged in history. But I agree. I mean, there are so many examples like Joe Sacco or Art Spiegelman or all the wonderful people out there who have done book on war or conflict or history. And it really gets to you in a different way. And that's also why we watch films about that. I mean, with films, I think people in the general population are much more aware that images are powerful. But when we look at graphic novels, I think there isn't as much of a public awareness yet that we can tell stories about serious subject matters with drawn images, because they inform our understanding of history and they can impact us on an emotional level.
So we've talked a little bit about the visuals and your process and all that, and I'm interested, before we run out of time, to talk about kind of the publishing end of things. You have what I feel like is a kind of an incredible website that's sort of based around this book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if that was something that was realized kind of in conjunction with the release of the book, or something that was kind of created after the book had been out for a while.
I mean, I had a website, I mean, the same website, but not with this page up. And I had a book section. And then when you clicked on books, it's still like that today. When you click on books, you see an overview of all the books I've done. And then you click on the particular book and more information pops up. But I did a presentation right before the book came out to the Jewish Book Council. They have an organization where every year there's an event for authors who do books about Jewish subjects in the widest sense, and they can present it within 3 minutes to representatives of organizations from across the country, who hopefully then invite you to come speak. And it was a nerve-wracking thing for me, because I'm not Jewish, but the book, and the book is about the Holocaust, and so I didn't know how it was going to be received at that particular event, given that the book had not come out and had not been reviewed yet. So then I spoke to somebody else in advance of the event who had done it before, and who said to me, you should probably put something online so that people can actually get more information, because 3 minutes can also be really misleading, especially when you talk as a German about the subject. You can really misunderstand it in a way. And so when he said that, I quickly put this together, and I made it the main page for the moment. I mean, that'll change when my next book eventually comes out. And for the moment, it's the first page that comes up, and it has, so my agent who I work with, he recommended different categories. So I forgot, but there's the main information, and then there's quotes about the book, from reviews, events, press releases, or about the book. And then I have a process video further down where you can see how I draw. And then you also have a video of my assistant flipping through the book. So somebody who doesn't own the book, because it's a visual book, you need more than just a written description. You need to give the potential buyer an insight into what it actually looks and feels like in your hand. And so that's why I put all that stuff up.
I think it's really great, and I'd like to see more of that kind of stuff when books are released. It feels like an asset, and it's not just you know, like a picture of the cover and a blurb or something, there's kind of like something additional you get when you go to your site in terms of being able to kind of gauge what the book is about and that kind of stuff.
I mean, I'm represented by a literary agency which represents mostly, you know, nonfiction authors, basically. So I think my thinking really came from that. So I went to a lot of author websites to see how they promote their, you know, I mean, authors who don't work with images, how they, you know, promote their books. And I think they probably do it differently than we do as visual people. And one site that I really appreciated was the one by Haruki Murakami, the Japanese novelist. I thought he had a very just visceral way of drawing you in, and I can recommend that as a reference too.
It seems like you are more involved than maybe the average cartoonist or illustrator in terms of foreign editions. A lot of artists will just kind of let their publisher handle it, and then they're, you know, one day they get like a Russian version of their book in the mail and be like, oh, that's strange. I kind of hate the way they did this. Is that a conscious choice on your part to just be more involved in that process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm a bit of a perfectionist in that way, even though my style looks kind of messy, but I care very much about the detail. And so I don't like to leave it to somebody else to make those decisions. And that said, it's also because my book does not follow a grid. You know, if every page had basically the same grid, I think then the designer would pretty quickly know, where do I put the text, and how, you know, I mean, still, of course, it can look bad, but because every page looks entirely different, it can really look bad if it's not done right. And another issue, which some of you have probably addressed, is the problem that in translation, the text can really shrink or expand. And so I was just working on the Danish edition, and it was terrible because, you know, half the page was blank all of a sudden. And I mean, I designed all of the pages in a way where there's a tight, you know, unified look to the combination of the image and the text, where the text becomes, I mean, you all do this, a visual element on the page. And then when you have half the text, all of a sudden, you know, you can't leave the page like that. So then you have to decide in every country, in every translation, how you're going to solve that problem. And sometimes I've also used text in a way where I put a color layer on top of the text, or where I make the background kind of shine through.
Right. Or the fading text, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, and so I mean, the whole project is so much work for every publisher involved. I pity people who have to work on my book.
Well, I can't imagine, especially when you get into, you know, a more like iconographic language or something like Mandarin or something. I don't know if your books have been translated into more visual alphabets like that. But
right now I'm working on the Korean edition, and it's actually surprisingly similar. I mean, the way I do the corrections, but I was very surprised. There was one page where, you know, I suddenly realized that, you know, they added things that I hadn't put in the original text for historic reference, and I only noticed it by coincidence. And so, you know, I don't know. I do think it's very important to carefully look at each. I mean, for me at least, each of the foreign editions.
Can you talk a little bit about the cover design changes between hardcover and paperback?
Yeah. So in general, now I don't have the original here, the hardcover, but my American publisher wanted on the cover to show that I'm working with photographs and illustrations, so that there is a collage approach to the project and it's not entirely drawn. So then they asked me to put a drawing in a photographed landscape. And I found a photograph in a library in my hometown that shows a landscape of the Black Forest, which is an area close to where I grew up. And I like this idea of merging those two images, because in that photograph there was also a man who was looking at the landscape, and it's a photograph from 1900. And I found it so interesting that he was sitting in the same landscape, looking at the same landscape before the two world wars had happened. Whereas the drawing of me looking at that landscape is of me knowing what I know now. And sorry, my daughter is just sneaking into the room.
Hey.
So that was decided for the American edition. And then the Germans really wanted the reference to, or not wanted, but I don't know if you know this Caspar David Friedrich painting of a man from behind looking at a landscape. It's called Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, I believe.
Yeah, and he's a very kind of dark dressed figure, right?
Yeah, with a walking stick. And it's an iconic image for a lot of Germans. And to me, it really represented, for myself, it represented this German looking at the past, looking from a distance, from a geographical distance, as me, living in America, looking at Germany, but also as a new generation looking at the past, looking back. And I like the idea that you couldn't see my face. It was a clear reference to the Caspar David Friedrich painting. And in Germany, everybody would get that, but in other countries, probably not. So in France, they used the same exact cover, but they wanted me to put a profile in here because, they have a very graphic novel heavy history, and they felt like the potential buyer wouldn't identify with the character unless there were a face. So every country had their own approach. And for other European editions, I also eliminated the walking stick, because in Germany, hiking is, a big part of our national identity almost, I would say, going to the forest, hiking, the whole tradition of the walking stick, at least in the past, was a big part of our culture. And maybe here it would read more like a graphic novel about somebody who's gone through knee surgery or something like that.
So yeah. Well, in some countries are famously anti-hiking.
And so I eliminated certain elements in the, but then I don't know what happened. My publisher in America suddenly decided to use the German cover for their edition.
Is there an edition that is there an edition that's like your favorite? I love the look of the new cover with the drawn landscape.
It's hard. I think they both have a different quality. I do happen to like this figure without a face, because I think it draws you in a different way. It's also, I avoid for the most part showing myself in the book, and I also have this personal collection of photographs from German flea markets of people from behind looking at landscapes, because it's something that I found in so many variations at flea markets, and it's, to me, there's a really mysterious quality to it, and I just think it draws you in a different way, and it has this double meaning too. There's this person looking at the past, but then there's also this invisible person who's watching the person who's looking, and that's something that I also associate with German identity, because we feel like we're being watched, because we have to redefine who we are, and we're still in the process of doing that, but it's a tricky thing to do given our history.
Well, we have just a few minutes, Nora, left, and now comes the potentially painful question. I remember once I went to a talk with Chris Ware after he just had released Building Stories, and the first question someone said is, "What are you working on next?" And he just like put his head on his desk, because he was just like, "I just finished this like 5-year project, and you already want me to make a new thing." I know Belonging has been out for a little bit, but I'm curious if you have plans for a new project, or already starting that next project.
Well, I am working on a new project that's not my own writing, though. I felt like I needed a break from my own head. So I was approached by Timothy Snyder, the historian. He teaches at Yale, and he has written a lot of books about the Holocaust, but also other subjects on 20th century European history for the most part. And he published a book called On Tyranny. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's a very small, I don't have it here. It's almost a bit like a handbook, and that's, I think, also what it's meant to be. And it's basically 20, the subtitle is 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. So it's a book about what we can do to defend our democracy today, given the difficult circumstances we are living through, especially with a focus on the United States, but also other countries. And he gives examples in each chapter of what happened in Europe and how there are similarities to today and what we can do to avoid, what happened from happening again. And so he approached me and asked me if I could do a fully illustrated edition of this book, which was very appealing to me because I needed a break from my own writing. And I also, it is, to me, in a way, a continuation of my project, because it's equally about how we can learn from history. And I've been enjoying it a lot because I think it's important. It's an important, these are important questions to ask yourself. And it's an important challenge for me as an illustrator to think about how I can visualize these thoughts of his. It's slated to come out in 2021, so next year, hopefully. And then what I'm going to do next is still open. There are several, subjects I'm interested in, but I really want to, again, I'm somebody who doesn't work very quickly, and I also don't want to put anything out there for the sake of putting something out there. I really want it to be deeply felt and deeply thought through, and so I think it'll probably take quite a long time, more than Chris Ware's 5 years.
We'll keep an eye out for that stuff down the road. Nora, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you so much.
We wish you the best there in New York for you and your family. Here in Vermont, it's sad to lose out on the opportunity to get to have you as a guest in person, but we're so honored that you were able to still join us.
Thanks so much for joining me.
I just want to thank one last time the Center for Cartoon Studies, the Leslie Center of Humanities at Dartmouth College, and the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation, and in particular, Carl and Nancy Gropper, who all together have made this event possible. Nora Krug, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Have a good day and stay healthy.
For those that are interested, I tried the Jammy Dodgers that my dad sent me, and they're even more disgusting than I thought.